Well, the star of the show tonight is one of my really good friends in the United States Senate, a man who loves our country with an amazing story. He only has a couple of problems, and if you can hear me back there, Marco, I'm not sure why you could not get into the University of South Carolina. And he had to go to the University of Florida. It's okay, Hank, it's okay. My brother from another mother, it's okay, Hank. And he went to the University of Florida, and he wanted to come to the University of South Carolina for law school. He couldn't get in, so he had to go to the University of Miami. But he is perhaps the most eloquent speaker on hope in our party. Please help me welcome my good friend and our presidential candidate, Marco Rubio.
Thank you.
Trey, I'm glad you didn't hug him for more than 3 Mississippis. I was worried about you for a second.
I like it.
You know, I was counting 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and then he let go. Whew. Thank God.
I like him. What can I say?
I could tell. You might want to, don't share a seat. You sit over there, I'll sit over here. It'll be all right. Marco, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. And thank you for the invitation. Tim Scott is a great colleague of mine. I've enjoyed very much getting to know him and very much appreciate the work he's already putting in. And his message is really an uplifting one. We'll talk about that a little bit today, because I think conservatism at the end of the day is about upward mobility, about individual empowerment, about the chance to achieve your dreams. And I don't think anyone embodies that more in the United States Senate than Tim Scott. And I know he's proud to serve each of you in the United States Senate. And it's great being with Trey Gowdy as well. I think he's done a phenomenal job of accountability, of holding people accountable. As you followed on the news, he takes his job extremely seriously. And I have tremendous admiration for the work he's doing and has been doing for quite some time. And it's an honor to be with both of them here in South Carolina. A couple points I wanted to start with. Had I known I was going to run for president 20 years ago, I would have gone to the University of South Carolina. Call it bad planning, I suppose. And now I had some extensive remarks this evening. Unfortunately, they were on my server at home, so I've lost those. But so I'm going to wing it for like 6 minutes, and then I'm going to listen to your questions. First of all, I want to tell you why I'm running for president. I think it's the most important question anyone running should be able to answer. Why are you running? And you should ask candidates. You're going to see a lot of candidates here. South Carolina is important. And there are a lot of candidates running this year. 1 out of 5 Republicans is a presidential candidate in 2016. So I'll tell you why I'm running. I am running because I want America to continue to be the kind of country where people can do for their children what my parents were able to do for me. My parents came here in 1956. They had no advanced education, no connections, no money, and they never became rich or famous. And yet they fully achieved the American dream because they owned a home in a safe and stable neighborhood. They found work as a bartender and as a maid that allowed them to provide for their family. They were able to retire with dignity and security. And they were able to leave all 4 of their children better off than themselves. See, that's the real American dream. It has nothing to do with how much money you make or how many things you own on the day you die. The American dream is about achieving happiness. And for my parents, happiness was the ability to give us the life they never had the chance to have. It troubles us now that a growing number of Americans feel it's no longer possible in the 21st century for people like them. It troubles us deeply because if we lose that, we've lost our identity as a nation and as a people. And so that's what this election needs to be about. I believe with all my heart that despite our challenges in this 21st century, that dream can be possible for more people than ever before. But it will require us to change the way we're doing business. For starters, we need policies that allow us to be globally competitive again, because we have an economy today that is a global one. It requires us to compete with countries all over the world, and we are increasingly losing that competition, not because of anything we're doing wrong in our lives or in our businesses, but because of government policies that are holding us back. In the 21st century, some of the best paying jobs will require more skills than ever before. But we have a higher education system designed in the 1950s that today is too unresponsive, too unaffordable, and quite frankly is leaving millions of Americans behind. It's also important that the federal government keep us safe. It is the most important obligation of the federal government that it keep us safe, and it is failing in that regard as well. But what happens if we change these things? What happens if we adopt policies that allow us to be economically competitive again in the world through tax reform and regulatory reform and balancing our budget and repealing and replacing Obamacare? Well, then our economy will create millions of the best paying jobs of the new economy. And what happens if we revolutionize higher education so that it is more cost effective and affordable and reaches more people? Then millions of Americans will have the skills they need to succeed in this new economy. And what happens if we rebuild our military and have a foreign policy of moral clarity, where our allies know they can trust us and our adversaries know not to test us? Then the world will be safer and more stable. This is the opportunity of our time. We have extraordinary challenges, but we have real opportunities, and we should embrace them. For if we do, there is no reason why the 21st century can't also be an American century, and there is no reason why the American dream can't just survive, but it will reach more people and change more lives than ever before. That is the extraordinary opportunity before us now in this election. But it can only happen if we elect the right people to the House and to the Senate, but especially in the White House. And I'm proud to be in South Carolina today because in about 6 months, you will begin the process of electing the new president. And the good news is it signals the end of the Obama era. But now we must decide what comes next. What is next for America? Look, I know that times are tough, and I know that people are angry. Times are tough because the jobs that once sustained us have been sent overseas or replaced by a machine. You open up the newspaper and it says Wall Street had another record day, but not in your life. Everything costs more. And the job that once allowed you to save money, you now live paycheck to paycheck. So I know that people are economically frustrated. I know that people are frustrated with the education they got. Because you're a young American who was told your whole life, go to school, get a degree. So you did. You even borrowed money to pay for it. And now you owe thousands of dollars in student loans, and the only jobs you can find you could have had without the loans and even without the degree. And then you open up the newspaper and you read about how somewhere else in the world a radical jihadist group has beheaded more people or took over another community somewhere or even another country. And America seems unable to do anything about it. These are troubling times. These challenges we face are real. And yet, despite all of our challenges, I ask you this. What country would you trade places with? What nation on earth would you rather be? There is still no nation on this planet I would rather be than ours, despite our many challenges. Because we forget, it is true, our government is broken, absolutely. But America is not a government. We have a government, and it needs to be improved, and it needs to be fixed, and it needs to be more accountable and more responsive. But our country is not a government. Our country is a people. Over 300 million people, millions of whom get up every single morning and go to work and raise their families and volunteer in the community and open a business and hire more people because they're successful. That is our country. What we need is a government that gives us a chance. We're not going to get that if we keep electing the same people. We are on the road of decline. We're a great country, but if we stay on the road we are on right now, we will not leave for our children a country as great as the one that was left to us. In fact, if we continue on the road we are on right now, we will be the first generation in American history to leave our children worse off than ourselves. But that is not an inevitability. That would be a choice. There is another choice before us. And that is to do what the generations before us did. And what they did throughout our history is they confronted the great challenges and also embraced the extraordinary opportunities. And this is a nation that has confronted some great challenges. The Civil War was a great challenge. The Great Depression was a great challenge. 2 world wars, extraordinary challenges. The 1960s were a time that the country was almost split apart through the civil rights fights and Vietnam, great challenges. We survived disco music in the 1970s, an incredible challenge. That doesn't always go well. In South Carolina, it does. In Nevada, they like disco. I don't know. We have faced great challenges before, both in our lives and in our country. And And ours is the story of 230 years of successive generations of Americans who did what they needed to do. They confronted the great challenges, and because they did, they were able to embrace the extraordinary opportunities. And so what you and I face right now is nothing more than our turn. Now our turn has come to confront the great challenges and solve and embrace the great opportunities of our time. And we must. For if we do not, then we will take our place in history as the first Americans to leave our children worse off than ourselves. But if we do, we'll be able to leave behind for our children a country freer and more prosperous, even than the one that was left for us. And I'll just close by saying we all have an obligation to do this. I've always felt a strong one. You see, for me, America is not just the country that I was born in. This is literally the nation that changed the history of my family. I talked briefly about my parents. When my father was 9 years old, his mother passed away. They had like a small catering business in Havana, which meant she cooked, and my grandfather delivered the food to cigar factories in Havana. And when she died, they lost the cook, the business was gone. So my father was 9 years old when his mother died. And so he had to quit school and start working with his dad just to feed themselves. He would never go back to school. He would work for the next 70 years of his life. As I told you, in 1956, they came here to America. He didn't have much of an education, neither did my mother. He worked primarily as a banquet bartender at hotels. My mother did everything. She built aluminum chairs at a factory. She was a cashier at a hotel on Miami Beach. She was a maid at a hotel in Las Vegas when we lived there for a few years. And then we moved back to Miami. She was a stock clerk at Kmart. When my parents came to America, all the dreams they had when they were young, they were no longer within their reach. They had big dreams because young people always have big dreams. So they got a new dream. You know what their dream was? You know what the very purpose of their life was? They wanted to make sure that what happened to them didn't happen to us. They wanted to make sure that all the dreams that became impossible for them would be possible for their children. And so my father worked well into his 70s as a banquet bartender. On nights, on weekends, on holidays, on days I'm sure he didn't want to go work. He stood behind a small portable bar in the back of a banquet hall. So one day I could be here in South Carolina standing before you as a candidate for the highest office in the land. And the journey from behind that bar to where I stand tonight, that's the real essence of the American dream. And here's the great news. That's not just my story. That's your story. In this country, every single one of us is but a generation or two removed from someone who did that for us. From someone who made our future the purpose of their lives. Every single one of us here is but a generation or two removed from someone who did that. And maybe you're the one making that journey now. And so our calling as Americans is to ensure that that journey always remains possible. In fact, our calling is to ensure that it is possible for more people than it has ever been. Because at the end, that's what makes us special. Every country in the world has rich people. Every country in the world has famous people. But few of any countries has people like my parents or yours, who were never rich and were never famous, but achieved happiness and left their children better off than themselves. That is what makes us special. And whether we remain special or not will be determined by whether that is still possible in the 21st century. And if we do what needs to be done, not only will it be possible, it'll be possible for more people than ever before. Not only will America be great, it'll be greater than she's ever been. And the 21st century won't just be as good as the 20th century. It'll be better. It'll go down in history as a new American century. So I look forward to talking to you about that tonight. Thank you. Thank you. Do I stand up for the questions?
No,
All right.
well, as you know, we, in our town halls, Trey and I ask questions to the audience, like thorough answers, not necessarily novels, but really thorough answers. That's good. Yeah.
I'll try to keep it to a short essay.
Even better. One of the things that you discussed in your opening comments was the importance of education in this country. Susan from Ravenel is with us tonight and has a question on education. I will tell you that one of the things that my mother, Frances Scott, who's with us, Mom, wave at everybody. taught me many things in my life. One of the things that she taught me was the psychology of the switch. So we'll get to that later, however. We'll get to that later. The question on the card, however, really has to do with how do we improve the education in our country? And frankly, as Susan asked the question, I think about folks like Jory and Ava, who are young kids going to a Christian academy looking for a better opportunity as their parents try to shape the future. Can you help us understand, as president, how would you reform education, K through 12 and or college?
Well, pre-K through 12 is primarily a state function. And in fact, entirely a state function. I don't think the federal government has much of a role to play other than perhaps to make it easier for parents to be able to afford to send their kids to a school of their choice. And I know I'm here with him tonight, but Tim Scott's been a leader in school choice efforts across this country, and he should be recognized for that because it really is. But K through 12 education belongs to states and local communities. Trust me, you don't want the federal government running schools. We don't need a federal school board. I favor and I support curriculum reform at the state level. We don't need Common Core or any such effort like that across. Now, higher education has a federal role for the following reason. It is the single biggest payer of higher education in the country. We have an outdated higher education model. It was designed in the 1950s. It doesn't work anymore. Number one, we know that some of the fastest growing, best paying jobs of the 21st century require more than traditional high school, but less than 4 years of college. We stopped teaching people to do this work. So we don't train people to be airplane mechanics or BMW technicians or work at the body shop. We don't train electricians. We don't train plumbers. We don't train welders. That doesn't make any sense. A welder makes a lot more than a Greek philosopher. So we need to reinvigorate vocational education, and I believe we should open up federal financial aid. I believe we should open up federal financial aid, so if a 17-year-old has decided they want to fix airplanes for a living, don't wait till they're 18 and graduate high school before starting to teach them. Teach them now. So when they graduate with a high school diploma and an industry certification, and they're ready to work right away. The second issue is it's not flexible enough. So you've got millions of Americans who are raising children and need to work full time, but they also need to go back to school. And on this front, I always focus very much on single women raising children by themselves, because there's millions of them on the edge of poverty. So a perfect example, a young lady that worked for me, she was my secretary when I was the Speaker of the Florida House. She made about $28,000 a year. She was able to go back to school and become a paralegal and made $55,000 or $60,000 a year. We need to make it easier for more people to do that. Today, they cannot under the traditional model. It would require them to quit work and sit in a classroom for 2 to 4 years, and they cannot afford to do that. But imagine if we had an alternative accrediting model that allowed people to get credit for what they've learned, no matter how they learned it, what they've learned, not just how many hours they sat in a classroom. So you would get credit for what you've already learned on your own. If you've worked for 10 years as a receptionist at a law firm, you've learned something. Give you credit for what you've already learned and allow you to learn the rest online, sometimes for free, on your own schedule, not on a semester basis. Through a combination to package all of that learning into the equivalent of a degree, that would create competition for traditional higher education, but would also empower millions of Americans to acquire the skills they need to go from being a receptionist at $10 an hour to a dental hygienist at $55,000 a year. I'm not saying we're not going to have traditional 4-year colleges. Of course we are. How else would we have college football? But, right? But I am saying this, we can't continue to graduate people with thousands of dollars in loans and a degree that doesn't lead to a job. And I feel very passionately about it because I myself owed over $100,000 in student loans. In fact, when I became a senator 4.5 years ago, I still owed over $100,000 in student loans, which I paid off with the proceeds of my book, An American Son, now available on paperback. But it is available on paperback. Although I make more on the hardcover, so I encourage you to. But anyway, my point being is that first of all, this competition to higher education will at least help to hold the line down on tuition growth, because these colleges have no competition. They charge you whatever they want. Second, if you've already got a student loan, you should be able to pay it back on the basis of how much you make. So the more you make, the faster you pay back your loan. The less you make, the less of a burden it's going to be. But third, our students deserve more information. Before you take out a loan, they should be required to tell you, this is how much people make when they graduate with that degree from that school. And then you can decide whether or not it's worth borrowing $50,000 to major in Greek philosophy.
Congressman.
Speaking of college football, there's a game on tonight, so I want to say thank you to each of you for coming out. And Senator Christina from Mount Pleasant has a question about small business, what you will be able to do in your administration to help them with specific reference to the tax code.
That's a great question. First of all, in America today, we have more businesses dying than starting for the first time in 35 years. More businesses dying than starting. That's an extraordinary statistic. And it goes counter to everything we believe about this country. Why is that happening? There's a lot of reasons. The tax code is one of them. We have one of the most expensive tax codes in the world. A lot of small business, many of you here tonight, if you own a small business, you're organized as an S corporation, right, or a partnership. So that means you're paying on your personal rate. You're paying it sometimes as high as 39.5%. Meanwhile, a big corporation might be paying 0 because there's all sorts of loopholes built into the code. So we need to create parity. I would say no business in America, big or small, S corporation, C corporation, business income should never be taxed at more than a globally competitive rate, a maximum of 25% flat for everybody, not 39.5, not 35. Second, we have to bring regulations under control. Regulations are an extraordinary impediment on business formation. Now, with the tax code and the regulations, let me tell you who doesn't necessarily always mind it. The big corporations don't mind a lot of taxes and regulations. Why? Because they can afford to hire the best lobbyists in Washington to create loopholes and the best lawyers to find them. But a small business starting out of the spare bedroom of your home, not only are you probably in violation of the zoning code, but you can't deal with all those regulations, which is why I believe we need a regulatory budget in America, which means every year we would set a hard cap on how much regulations can cost our economy. So let me give you an example of how that would work. 2 weeks ago, the federal government, in 1 week, imposed $2 billion, in just 5 days, $2 billion of new regulatory costs. If we had a regulatory budget, they would have had to cut $2 billion of regulatory costs if they wanted to impose $2 billion of regulatory costs. None of these are silver bullets, but it would help hold the line on regulations, which are often used by established industries as a competitive advantage on a small startup. The third point I would make is the healthcare law is devastating to small businesses. We have a healthcare law now in America that basically does the following. It has increased the price of healthcare, but it covers less, and it encourages businesses not to hire people. Other than that, it's a pretty good idea, I guess. But I mean, the point is a terrible law, and it really hurts small business in particular. And the fourth point I would make is don't overlook the impact of community banks on small business. Community and local banks are the key to capital access for a small business. You know, if you're a small startup business, you're not going to go into Wells Fargo or Citibank and get a loan. They don't do those kinds of things. You relied on your local community banker, your regional bank, to provide that source of funding for you. Those banks are vanishing because of Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank has created a mountain of regulations that these middle-sized banks and smaller cannot comply with. So they go out of business. And so the access that people once had to capital has vanished as well. So if we can do these sorts of things, in addition to a well-trained workforce, suddenly empowerment, small business formation becomes possible again. And I don't want to leave out one more mention of student loans, because our entrepreneurial class is always going to continue to be fed by new people that enter the workspace, or someone who's worked somewhere for a few years that believes they have a good idea and wants to put it into practice. If you owe $50,000 in student loans, you can't start a business. You need a steady paycheck in order to pay those loans. So that's also been an impediment to small business formation for many younger Americans. We've got to do all of these things to create an environment where small business can succeed again.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Lynn Smith of Mount Pleasant. As you know, Vivi, we have a lot of concerns in the area around the issues of Gitmo and Guantanamo Bay, looking at the president trying to move anyone here from Gitmo is a ridiculous idea. Can I get an amen? I wanted to make sure we were in church together here. So, Lynn's question is, can you comment on the ways that the Cuban relations that we have now, lifting the embargo, trying to normalize the relationship with Cuba, will have a negative impact on our national security?
Well, let me start out by describing the true nature of the Cuban government, because there's this notion in the popular media that they are some sort of Cold War relic, harmless, no longer relevant. Nothing could be further from the truth. Let me give you some facts about the Cuban government, other than the fact that they're an anti-American communist dictatorship. They harbor dozens of fugitives of American justice. For example, they have provided safe harbor for the assassin, the killer of a New Jersey state trooper who escaped from jail, went to Cuba, and has been living there ever since under the protection of their government. But it's not just that. There's dozens of people that have stolen your money living in Cuba off the millions of dollars they stole from the American taxpayer. These are people that came to the United States from Cuba, opened up a fake pharmacy or a fake healthcare provider, billed millions of dollars fraudulently from Medicare, and then when we were about to catch them, they got on an airplane, flew back to Cuba, and they're living there. And they're buying houses, and $1 million goes a long way in that economy. They're harboring them. They're also, by the way, the 2 Cuban generals have been indicted in U.S. courts for the assassination of 4 American citizens in international airspace in 1996, the Brothers to the Rescue. Cuba was also caught helping North Korea evade international sanctions. About a year and a half ago, they shipped weapons through the Panama Canal. That ship was intercepted. No one ever talks about these things. In 2 different cities in Cuba today, they host a Russian and a Chinese listening station from where the Chinese and the Russians electronically spy on NASA, Central Command, Southern Command, and Special Operations Command, all located in Florida. That is the true nature of the regime vis-a-vis the United States. They also, by the way, there is no Cuban economy. The entire Cuban economy is run by a holding company, which is operated by a military general who is Raul Castro's son-in-law. So any economic opening to Cuba is really an economic opening to this holding company. And last but not least, if you travel to Cuba and you stay at a hotel and you buy products, you are trafficking in stolen goods. Because when the Castro Revolution took over, they stole what today is valued at $7 billion of private property, including the property of American companies and citizens that today are being used by the regime for profit for them. But they're trafficking. If you stay at the Hotel Nacional in Havana, you are staying at a hotel stolen from the Intercontinental Hotel Company. If you drink Havana Club rum, you are stealing money from a refinery that was built by the Bacardis. So these are the problems with these relations. Now, how will it impact U.S. national security? Well, it's going to empower that government that I just described to you. It's going to provide them millions of dollars in hard currency, which they will use to further strengthen their grip on power on the island of Cuba, and which they will continue to use to fund the 3rd most active intelligence agency operating within the United States. A lot of people don't realize this small island, I'm on the intelligence committee, that small island is the 3rd or 4th most active intelligence agency in the United States. They spy on America, and they sell those secrets to our enemy as a profit center. So this is who we're funding with this opening, in exchange for what? For nothing. They released 53 political prisoners. More than half have been rearrested. Since the president signed that deal with Cuba in December, over 3,000 people have been rounded up and arrested in Cuba. In fact, the Cubans haven't lied about it. They've said very simply, thank you, America, for your change towards us. This proves that communism has finally won. But we're not changing a thing on the island. So this is who we're dealing with here. And I know that it's not something that most Americans listen to on a regular basis. But it's the reality, and it is evidence of the appeasement-based foreign policy of this administration. Oh, and they want Guantanamo back too, by the way. They've insisted on that.
Crazy. They can't have it. Trey?
Senator David from Mount Pleasant wants to know what a Rubio administration would do about Putin's expansionism into the Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and the Baltic states.
Well, it begins by understanding who Vladimir Putin is. Vladimir Putin basically is a gangster. And I don't mean that affectionately. I mean, that's what he is. He's a gangster. He is an organized crime figure. And the evidence of that is what happens to an opponent of Vladimir Putin. If you're a political opponent of Vladimir Putin, 3 things happen. You're shot in the street mysteriously. You wind up with plutonium in your drink, and they're poisoned by radioactive, or you wind up in the court system on trumped-up charges. So this is the way he operates. What is he doing in Europe now is very simple. He is trying to destroy NATO. And the way you destroy NATO is by challenging an Article 5 country, which is what eventually he's going to do. Article 5 is the article in the NATO compact that says an attack on one is an attack on all. That's the only reason why NATO matters. If one of those countries in NATO is attacked by Russia or anyone, and the rest of NATO does not respond, that is the end of NATO. It's just a piece of paper at that point. Vladimir Putin knows it. And he is creating a scenario where eventually he will test, whether it's one of the Baltic states or whoever it may be. Now, Ukraine was a trial run for that effort, but eventually you will see him militarily test a NATO ally unless we can change the cost-benefit analysis. So it starts with reinvigorating NATO, ensuring that our allies in the NATO alliance and non-NATO members like Ukraine have the defensive capabilities to change the dynamics, to change the cost-benefit analysis for Vladimir Putin, because right now he believes he can arm these separatist groups and send in special operations forces, and there's no price to pay for it. There's no price to pay for it domestically or elsewhere. Second, we would continue with the economic sanctions. And the most devastating economic sanction we can impose on Vladimir Putin is to allow American oil companies to export abroad so that we can send a message to his customers. You don't have to buy from him anymore. And so we would clearly inform him, we are going to use the natural resources of the United States to challenge you economically, to further decapitate your economy until you change your ways. And the third is something you never hear enough about. He is waging a propaganda war in Europe. The Kremlin actively sponsors radio and televisions and newspapers all across the region who are not just feeding an anti-European line by an anti-Western line. And I think it's time to reinvigorate Radio Free Europe, reinvigorate the Voice of America, to counter some of this propaganda that they're putting out there, which are planting the seeds within many of these nations on his periphery. This anti-European, anti-Western, anti-American propaganda. Again, at the end of the day, this is a very serious situation because between the United States and Russia, we possess 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. So this is a very serious problem. We're not looking for a confrontation. But we cannot allow Vladimir Putin to destroy NATO because if we do, all of Europe becomes destabilized and we have entered into a second Cold War.
Senator Rubio, South Carolina, and Charleston specifically, is the home to a lot of veterans. We have a lot of men and women who served our country bravely, and we thank God for them. Tom Bocci, let's give him a hand. Tom Bocci of North Charleston wants to know, under your administration, how do we ensure the VA does what it's supposed to do, and how do we make sure that the benefits that we promised the men and women when they were in the uniform are the benefits that we live up to as a country?
Well, I'm sure that you and your offices get a lot of these calls. I do as well. Florida is also the home of many veterans. In fact, some of you who have served our nation may have served in one of the Florida installations at some point. And of course, we're grateful for your service. One of the veterans in Florida is my brother. He was a Green Beret in the late 60s, early 70s in the Army. And he has a dental claim that he's been fighting with the VA to get fulfilled. Every few years he has to go back and get dental work done. And they keep asking him to prove it was service-oriented. And his answer is, well, the only time I ever jumped out of a plane was in the Army. So, but that's how frustrating it's been. And that's a small-scale example of much bigger problems that we're facing. Let me begin by saying this, to be fair. There are some really good people working at the VA. They care about our veterans. They work really hard. They really do. And then we've got some people at the VA that are not doing a very good job. Well, let me talk to you about that. They've been fired. In 2000, late last year, I passed a bill, along with my colleague from Florida, Jeff Miller, that gave the VA secretary the power to fire senior executives that weren't doing their jobs. Now, at this point is where people say, you need a law to be able to fire someone who isn't doing their job in the federal government? Yes, you do. And we passed that law. They have fired one person since that time. And that goes back to a lack of executive leadership by this president. Later this month, we're going to pass a second bill that gives them the power to fire anyone, not just executives, but anyone who isn't doing their job. So accountability is important. But we don't have a president that's willing to do that. If I'm president of the United States, we're going to have a VA system that cares more about our veterans than about the job security of the people that aren't doing their jobs. My last point, but the VA also needs to be reformed. The system was designed in the mid to late 30s. And in the 21st century, it needs some reformation. It needs to be modernized. And every veteran should have the ability, if they have to wait too long for an appointment, they should have the ability to take their VA benefits and go to any doctor, any hospital that will see them, especially if they'll see them right away. So if I'm president, we will reform the VA and we will bring accountability to the VA.
Senator Fran from Johns Island has a wonderful question about the debt, $18 trillion. And the premise is that the debt is bipartisan, therefore the solution necessarily must be bipartisan as well. How would a Rubio administration work with the House and the Senate to get our debt and deficit under control?
Well, first we have to deal with what's causing the debt. So let's start by ruling out what's not causing our debt. Our debt is not caused by defense spending. It is not the cause of our national debt. Our debt is not caused by foreign aid. We need more accountability in foreign aid, but it's less than 1% of our budget. Our debt isn't even caused by the safety net programs, which I believe should also be reformed. The safety net should not be a way of life, but that's not the cause of our debt either. Our debt is caused by the way Social Security and Medicare are structured for future generations. Now, I'm from Florida. You may not know this, there are a lot of people in Florida on Medicare and Social Security. My mother's one of them. So let me just say flat out, I am against anything that's bad for my mother. But here's the truth. If we act now, we can save Social Security and Medicare, balance our budget, and not change anything for her. In fact, not change anything for people that are 55 years of age or older, or people getting ready to retire. But this is what it will mean. It will mean Social Security and Medicare is going to look different for me. And it's going to look different for future generations behind me. By the way, it's going to look different either way. It's either not going to exist or we reform it. And what do I mean by reform? Here's what I'm talking about. I'm going to have to retire 10 months later than my parents did. If I've been financially successful, my Social Security benefits may not grow as fast as my mother's is growing. And my Medicare could very well be the option of taking my Medicare money and using it to buy a private plan that I like better. These are not unreasonable changes to ask of my generation after everything our parents and grandparents did for me. And if we do that, we can save Social Security and Medicare, balance our budget, and leave it exactly the way it is for current beneficiaries. Now, here's where we get into the political part of this. I said this during my Senate campaign as well, in Florida. And I'll say this again. Anyone who tells you that we can leave it exactly the way it is and not change anything is lying. They're lying. Anyone who's in favor of doing nothing is in favor of bankrupting these important programs. The good news is if we act now, we can leave it exactly the way it is for current retirees and people who are about to retire. But it's going to have to look different for me. I'm 25, 30 years away from retirement. I mean, the average age of a senator is what, 70? So, we've got time. And I'm not going to be in the Senate. But anyway, my point is that yeah, term limits, right, exactly, term limits. I support them. But my point to you is that we can balance our budget if we do it now. The longer we wait, we're going to have a debt crisis. We are going to have a debt crisis. And I'm not saying there isn't waste in defense spending. I'm not saying there isn't abuse in all these other programs. Of course, we can never afford to throw away money. We've got to deal with all those other things too. But the debt is growing because of the things I just mentioned and the interest on the debt. And if things continue the way they are right now and the interest rates go up to a normal figure, right now they're historically low, we're going to spend more money on the interest on our debt than we do on our national security. So we've got to deal with this. Is the most predictable crisis in American history. And the sooner we act, the less disruptive these changes are going to be. The longer we wait, the harder it's going to be to solve.
Marco, many of us have watched over the last several weeks as the president has negotiated this deal with Iran. And most of us are in amazement that we're actually where we are with the president securing the votes. People like myself and also Roxy Rust of Charleston, and I know my good friend Don from Seacoast, all find ourselves wondering what is possible under a Rubio administration if in fact you are the president. How would you work towards changing that deal?
First, the deal's not binding on the next administration. Let me tell you what the deal basically is. We passed sanctions against Iran, who the president now brags is what brought them to the table. What he leaves out is he was against the sanctions. He fought against the sanctions. He didn't want more sanctions on Iran, but we passed them. Every sanctions bill we've ever passed has something in it called the national security waiver. What that means is if the president decides it's in our national security interest, he or she can waive the sanctions, not impose them. That's what he's going to do here, basically. He's going to utilize the existing national security waiver pursuant to this agreement. But this agreement is not a treaty. It is not binding on the next administration. So it's pretty simple. I've already said this. The first day that I'm president, we will reimpose the sanctions on Iran, and then I will ask Congress to increase them. And I will back it up with a credible threat of military force. So if you vote for me, that's what you're voting for. I was worried you wouldn't like my answer. By the way, that's not an idle threat. Let me tell you what I mean by that. We will give Iran a very simple choice. First of all, the American sanctions are the most important ones. Don't tell me that a German bank would rather have access to the Iranian economy over access to the American economy. Second of all, the choice we give Iran is very simple. If you enrich uranium or reprocess plutonium, you will not have an economy. And if you try to build a weapon, we will destroy your program. If we don't do that, if this deal goes through unabated, here's what's going to happen. You mark my words. There's cameras here tonight. Please.